Hi, I'm Seamless, and today is a new video in the Production Basics series. This is kind of not really part of the progression of the Production Basics, but really what this is about is to help you make better mixes in spite of your audio setup. What I mean by that is that it's probably a little rare for you to have a perfect listening environment. A perfect listening environment would be one where everything is set up and treated in such a way that the audio you hear is 100% representative of what's actually happening inside your DAW, which is super cool, but it's also kind of hard to create yourself, and it's also very expensive usually to kind of build a room that will do that. If you have that kind of environment, then yay, this isn't for you. But if you don't, then this is a good sort of a crutch for helping you compensate for that. For example, I have not necessarily perfect mixing environment. It's a pretty good mixing environment. Like I did what I could to mitigate the problems, but it's not super perfect. But the reason why it doesn't destroy my mixes is because I am very familiar with exactly why it isn't super perfect. So I don't make certain common mistakes. So let's talk about how this works. The way this works is that you go to your master and you put an equalizer in the last slot. This could be done in any DAW. This could be done in anything. And just in the output of whatever you're creating, the very last thing in the list is this EQ. Now, what you're going to do with this EQ, and actually how you're going to do this, is that you're going to find a reference track. You're going to find a piece of music that whether or not it plays perfectly on your system, you know intellectually and logically and objectively that it's perfect for you, which isn't necessarily objective, but it's just means that, like, for me, for example, I might pick Noisea's remix of Skrillex's Scary Monsters, Nice Sprites. I love the hell out of that track. And if the worst thing in the world is that my tracks sound balanced like that track, then I'm doing pretty okay. So what I would do is I would pick that track, I'd put it in my DAW, and I'd play it back with this EQ on, and the audio is coming through here. And then I would mess around with the EQ, and I would move it around in such a way where things sound better to me. And I can actually tell you that this is more or less what the EQ would look like, because I like, there to be a certain amount of bass. Like I like bass, like feeling bass. Sometimes I feel like the 2 to 5K is a little too loud. The high frequencies aren't loud enough. And there's a little bit this weird little mid-range area that feels kind of dull as well. This is sort of my compensation for my room. Now that I have this, what I do with it is I save it as, my compensator EQ, which is what I'm just going to call it. And when I go to make a new track or make any track or mix anything, I put this in the last slot of the mixer insert of the mixer. And what this will do is that when I do everything else, I make the track, and then I have the track's actual mastering EQ and then actual mastering compression. I will say that this is actually going to make your track clip. It's going to be clipping, but that's okay, because as long as it's the last thing there, usually, like, I also recommend that your mastering compression be the last thing in the chain for real, so that it doesn't clip. But it's going to clip because we're screwing around with the phases of the track as a result of using minimum phase EQ, which most EQs are. Don't worry about that. Just kind of let it do its thing. And then, because the next step is that once you finish your track with this on, you take it off. And now the mix will sound different to you, but it'll sound more like the mix of your reference track. It'll sound more correct as a result. And let me give you an example as to one of the problems that this could help fix. For example, I like to boost out, I would boost the low end. I know that I would because my system lacks low end presence. It's my monitors are KRK SD8s. They're 8-inch cones, and they're pretty big, pretty beefy. But being as close as I am to it, it's not enough room for bass frequencies to terminate. So this means that they're not going to be really heard very well. If I got up and stood back at the door, I would feel the bass really clearly. But I don't have a subwoofer, so I don't have any kind of reinforcement in the low end. This means that because what I'm hearing is a profile that's kind of like this, which is not enough bass, and I want to be even amount of bass. And if I feel like there's an even amount of bass in my tracks, what that actually means is that there's too much bass. Because if I were to go play it on a normally balanced system, there'd be way too much bass. This is called overcompensating. I am compensating for the lack of bass in my system, my perceived lack of bass, by boosting the bass, thus creating too much low end. But if I have this on here already boosting it so that it sounds comfortable to me, it actually sounds good to me. This means that in the rest of my mix, I might actually roll off on the bass a little bit. And this means that when I took off the master compensator EQ, which is the official name for this now, my mix won't have a huge bass presence that's too much for normal systems. And it should be more in line with whatever my reference track was. Because remember, the point of this EQ will inevitably be to compensate for the problems in your system. But in order to do that, you are just balancing a track in a way that sounds totally dope to you. It's not really an objective process. It's totally just how you think it should feel. And as a result, this will be doing all the compensating for you. And so I'll end up doing things like I might boost the 2K, 5K in my track to make it sound a little bit sharper. Because in my regular mixes, I actually bring it down a little bit because this is represented a little too harshly on my system. And, same thing with the high end and whatever. And this means that if I go and play it on like iPhone headphones or someone's car or some other mixing environment, it'll sound like the reference track. It'll be as balanced and as present and correctly as the reference track, which is not necessarily to say that the reference track is perfect or completely correct, but it is what I wanted because I knew that, noisy as engineering is totally fine. So that's, the purpose. That's the way that this works. And I hope that I explained this in a way that made sense to you. I actually don't do this. You might notice that I don't really do this on any of my tracks. And that's because of what I said, where I knew that this is more or less what I would do because I am very familiar with my mixing environment. I know that if there's a comfortable amount of bass, then that means it's too much bass. So I'll roll off on the bass. I know that I tend to bring this down too much. I know that the higher frequencies tend to be misrepresented. So like I know all these things so I can compensate for it manually. But getting there requires a hell of a lot of experience in your mixing environment and basically, failing and figuring out why. That's the downside of that, having that kind of experience. And if you don't, if you can't or don't want to do that, you could do this. Now, doing it the way I described, where you're making the compensation based on some track that you want to sound totally awesome, is one way of doing it. There are actually professional solutions for this. There's kits you could find on like Sweetwater and other musical equipment websites where their whole jobs are to put microphones in front of speakers and then listen to a signal pass through them and identify how the sound has changed according to your environment. And then it makes an EQ. It makes a compensator EQ in its own plugin format in such a way that it does precisely what we just described, except this is a way that you can do it yourself and for free. Of course, this isn't like, this isn't 100% perfect. This really is just kind of a tool to help you get it a little bit better. At the end of the day, you could just use the reference track, compare it to your track, and then make the changes yourself. That's another way of doing it. But this is kind of a way that you're able to do it and not think about it. This means that you can have this on and then you don't have to think about the balance anymore. Like you only need to balance the track in such a way that it sounds good to you now. You don't have to worry about your system not having enough bass. You don't have to worry about enough high end or how the mid range is handling it. Like you've already made all those compensations, which means you can just mix purely for music in the sense that it's how does it feel to you. That's the benefit of this. That kind of frees up your attention on that kind of regard. Anyway, yeah, so I hope that made sense. If you have any questions about this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.